Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 27 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about the mystery of near-death experiences. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hi, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
We'd like to get right into this episode and really get into this topic, which many of you, when you heard we were going to do it, have expressed some interest in. So, because it's such a fascinating idea. What is it like to die? What happens at the moment of our death? Not just after death, like in heaven or our judgment or that sort of thing, but when we die. And some people have claimed to have experienced death and to have come back to talk about it. Some people have even been clinically dead in hospital, but when they were resuscitated, they reported experiences like being out of their body, seeing their body from floating above their body in an operating room, or moving through a tunnel and seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, or encountering beings of light. And all of this has been called under the umbrella of near-death experiences, or NDEs. And so that's what we're going to talk about today on Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. So, Jimmy, what is it that is claimed about near-death experience?
Well, the claim is that when people die, they have NDEs with a common set of experiences. Commonly reported experiences including waking up and in a room, looks kind of like an office, maybe, and on the wall in front of you it says everything is fine. Or some people, like Australians, everything is bonzer, or yes, everything is great. Yeah.
That's if you happen to be a fan of The Good Place.
The Good Place, yes, which is a TV show set in the afterlife.
That's right.
So everything is fine, maybe what most people feel, but you don't actually see it written on a wall of an office.
Right.
But people do report experiencing, dying can be traumatic physically. And so not for everybody. Some people, just kind of gently fade away. But sometimes it's painful, like if you're having a heart attack. And people report experiencing the pain or the emotional distress of the dying process suddenly stopping and being replaced by feelings of peace and happiness and joy. They may report seeing a tunnel or moving through a tunnel, which may have which it may be dark, or it may have colors on the walls of the tunnel. They sometimes report moving towards a light at the end of the tunnel. They report floating above their bodies and seeing and hearing medical professionals working on them. They report meeting deceased relatives who welcome them. They also report meeting other beings that they interpret as angels, and frequently they'll report meeting a particularly important being of light who radiates a feeling of love. They sometimes report being given a review of the events of their lives, where they feel the impact of what they did to other people in their lives. So it's this moment of intense empathy for other people based on their own actions. And they then sort of pass judgment on themselves, about their moral character. They report seeing a beautiful place like a garden or a crystal city. They sometimes encounter a limit that they understand is a point of no return. And they sometimes desire to return, like if they have loved ones, like maybe you have, it's a parent, they have children they want to care for, or they'll just be told you need to return. And sometimes they don't want to because it's so beautiful. But one way or another, they end up returning, they come back to their body, and then report waking up in the hospital. And so these are the commonly reported experiences. Not everybody reports all of these. Many people report only a few of them. But this is the common set of things that get reported. And the claim is that these are authentic accounts of what happens to us immediately after death, and that they are therefore evidence of the afterlife.
Okay. So that's the claim. What are the counterclaims against these claims?
Well, the fundamental counterclaim is that they're not evidence of the afterlife. And the question is then what alternative explanation do you provide for these things? One possible explanation is some of the reports are just people lying.
Right.
People lie. Maybe they lie about this. Another proposed explanation is these experiences are produced by wishful thinking as a kind of psychological defense mechanism against the reality of death.
Okay.
Another is that they're produced by cultural contamination, that the idea of near-death experiences and what they're like is out there in the culture. And so people may be expecting this, or these ideas, these claims may influence people to think they've had an experience like this.
Right.
It could be that some of these experiences are dreams. We spend a lot of our lives having experiences that seem real at the time, but actually aren't. So maybe the dream mechanism in the dying brain produces these things. It could be, if it's not the dream mechanism, it could be something else, physiological, that induces a hallucination. Something about the way the brain shuts down could induce hallucinations of this nature. It could be that these are false memories developed after the person has been resuscitated, because there is a false memory phenomenon that is known. Back in the 1980s and 90s, there was that whole rash of so-called repressed memories that people were trying to recover. And they would remember things like being abused as a child, and they'd forgotten this because it was too traumatic. And then under psychological counseling, they remembered it, quote unquote.
Right.
Turned out all that was fake. But they were brought to a state where they thought they remembered things, even though it hadn't happened. And there are other theories as well. You can check out Wikipedia for those. We'll have a link in the show notes. But those are the basic counterclaims. Those are some of the more popular explanations of what these experiences are if they're not evidence of an afterlife.
Okay, and these are all things that are that are purported to be happening during a experience of dying. That's
either before, either during. It's something that happens while you're dying, or the memories get generated, or the lies get generated after you've been brought back.
Okay, all right. So, what are the facts that are available to us on this? What do we know about this?
Well, we've only been able to resuscitate people from clinical death since about 1960. Before that, the technology didn't exist. And there were reports of like these that go way back into history. The person didn't clinically measurably die in a hospital and then get brought back the way that it happens now. But people did have experiences where they almost died. And even though you couldn't say, well, now they're clinically dead, they almost died and they had experiences like this.
Can I ask, what do we mean by clinical death, to specify?
So clinical death is a really thorny subject that can be defined more than one way, but the key test is your heart stops.
Okay.
And without your heart pushing the blood through your veins, your brain will shut down within seconds of the stopping of your heart, like 30 seconds maximum. Your brain shuts down. And so you have a cessation of mental function as well. Everything goes dark, and you don't have brainwave activity. Okay.
All right. Just because I think that's probably going to be an important element in this discussion. Okay. Yeah. So go ahead. And what other facts are in evidence?
So in 1975, a guy named Raymond Moody, who's a psychologist or psychiatrist, wrote a book where he had studied these experiences. The book was called Life After Life. And this book became the thing that popularized near-death experiences. I remember reading it back in 75. It was a huge rage. And one of the things that Moody brought out, and has been subsequently brought out by other research, is that these things happen all over the world. This is not just something unique to our culture. They happen to people of all religions. And they happen to people who are not religious. The people who expect, oh, I'm going to die and that's going to be it. And then they have a near-death experience. As I mentioned, not everybody reports the same experiences, and not everyone reports them happening in exactly the same order. Some people report only a few. Some of them report like the tunnel being at a different point in their experience. Some of them will say it seems to be associated with leaving your body is like going through a tunnel. Others will say, no, I was out of my body and then I went through the tunnel to meet the beings of light. So there's some confusion about the exact order in which things happen, if these things are happening. Because of people's different religious backgrounds, they interpret the experiences differently. In the case of meeting like the one luminous being that radiates love, like Jewish people will say, okay, that's God. Mm-hmm. Christians will come back and say, that was Jesus. People who don't have a religion will come back and say, it was an unknown being that radiated love.
Okay.
So they have different interpretations of these. Also, you get some different claims. Like people will claim to hear things, like facts will be, or statements will be made to them by supernatural figures, either their dead relatives or angels or the being of love. They'll say things to them. And sometimes they're not always consistent with the Christian faith. Sometimes people will come back and say, oh, yeah, I was told that I was going to have a baby, but the soul for the baby was hesitant to be born, and so it's going to reincarnate somewhere else.
Oh, okay.
So not all of the data is consistent with Christian experience, with Christian faith, even though a lot of it is.
Right.
So we know that happens. One of the things that's very common in the for people who have these experiences is they have a change of values when they come back. They report feeling much more compassion for other people. They report feeling a greater sense of purpose in their lives, that there's something they're here to accomplish. They feel less materialistic. They are not as concerned about property and consumer gadgets and stuff like that. They're more concerned about ethical, emotional, spiritual values, and they're less afraid of death. Because they say, I've been there, it wasn't bad, I know what it's going to be now, and I'm comfortable with it now.
Okay.
So they report having a changed life experience as a result of the near-death experience. Recently, there have been some studies done. One of the most famous studies is called and it's not the only one, but one of the most famous studies is called the AWARE study. This was done by is headed by a guy named Sam Parnia, who is a physician who's worked in England and the United States. And he became interested in near-death experiences. And so he set up this AWARE study. It deals with awareness. The name is based on awareness during resuscitation. So these are all people who have clinically died. Their heart has stopped, and then they got revived. And of the people so most people whose heart stop, unfortunately, it doesn't restart most of the time. So they had thousands of cases of people whose heart stopped, and of the survivors, who they were able to interview, they had kind of a two-stage interview process, an initial kind of cursory interview, and then a more detailed interview. Usually when the person was still in the hospital, so the memories were still fresh. And of the people who survived the NDE, 90% of them did not have, who survived cardiac arrest, 90% of them did not report having an NDE. So 90% of them said it's just a gap. I don't remember anything. 9% of them do say, I had some of these experiences. The reason why there's that difference is not understood. One of the hypotheses that they have is when you die physically, your brain experiences trauma. And interestingly, it's not simply from the cessation of blood flow. It's really largely when the blood flow comes back. It causes brain inflammation. And so this trauma to the brain is known to cause amnesia. And the worse the trauma is, the worse the amnesia is. And so one of their hypotheses, and they're now doing another study called AWARE 2, where they're, which we'll talk about, they're trying to see, is there a correlation between the length of time that the person was dead and how much they remember afterwards? Because the theory is, if you're dead for longer, then when they get your heart restarted, it's going to cause more trauma and more inflammation to the brain. And so they think the people who were revived the quickest may be the ones who were able to retain memories of the near-death experience, and that they get wiped out in the case of people who are dead for longer periods of time and have more trauma and more brain inflammation.
Okay. And we know that the trauma of all kinds of physical trauma can cause amnesia, not just, loss of blood flow to the brain, but like any kinds of trauma can cause
the classic sitcom thing, you get hit on the head, you lose your memory. By the way, that ever happens to anybody, do not hit the person on the head another time. It will not make their memory come back.
No.
This isn't a toggle on-off thing.
No, it is not. You will probably kill them if you hit them again. Frankly, you might kill somebody the first time you hit them in the head. So, yeah. That's just...
few more statistics on that they were able to gather from the AWARE study. So 9% of the people reported NDEs of some kind. They reported some of these experiences. 2% described awareness with explicit recall of seeing and hearing actual events related to their resuscitation. So these are the people that said, I was floating above my body in the operating room or in the emergency room, and I saw and heard the people working on me to try to restart my heart. So that's about 2% of people report that.
Okay.
Of the 101 survivors who they did their stage 2 more advanced interview with, one had a verifiable period of conscious awareness during the time that cerebral function was not expected. So what that means is this person said, I remember seeing and hearing what happened when my heart was shut down and my brain was shut down. And they were able to verify that because the person said, here's what happened, and that was what happened. Now, the counter argument to that would be, well, maybe the person had minimal brain function that was undetectable or something, and they overheard it that way. And they imagined, seeing what was happening based on the sounds. So it's not proof, but it is an interesting statistic, and it is significant that they found somebody out of the 101. They did find that had the stage 2 interviews. They did find one person who they could actually verify something this person said happened during the period their heart and brain were shut down.
And the total number of people in this study,
it's in the thousands.
2060, I think, is what I'm seeing here. So one out of the 2060 had this, but which doesn't make it less believable. It just
no. That's why they're doing follow-up studies, because these are a lot of Raymond Moody's work was based on just interviews with people who said they had these experiences, and he's kind of relying on them, but he's not like going into their medical records and stuff here and verifying they had this cardiac arrest. Here, that's what they're doing. They're trying to do gold standard research. We are only looking at people who we know their heart stopped and what are their experiences while they're still in the hospital and so forth. Okay.
So from the reason perspective, as we examine these claims and the counterclaims, what is it we can deduce?
Well, so the big question is, are these evidence of an afterlife? And you kind of have to proceed in the Sherlock Holmes way of whatever's impossible, you eliminate that. And if there's something left, then that has to be true. So can we eliminate some of these based on the hypothesis that some of these people are lying? Yes, we know of cases where that is exactly what happened. There was a very famous book that came out in 2010. It was very famous in the Christian book market.
Yep.
It was called The Boy Who Came Back from Heaven, and it was by Kevin and Alex Malarkey. They were father and son.
Okay.
It is ironic their last name is Malarkey, because
Yes,
it turned out that's what the book was.
Right.
The son, who was the one that claimed to have died, and he did clinically die and then come back, he retracted the claims in 2015. He said, I made it up to get attention. I was a kid. And there's some question about, did he have some coaching in that regard? But he took responsibility and said, I was a kid. I made it up to get attention. So some people do lie, and profit motive, whether it's profiting in terms of attention or whether it's profiting in terms of cold hard cash by writing your book, both of those can be motives. If you've clinically died in the hospital and you get resuscitated, anybody could fake this stuff and write a book like this. So that is something we have to watch out for, and that does explain some of the reports. But most people who have these experiences do not go on to write books, and they don't go on to seek fame and profit. In fact, a lot of times, according to some of these people, they hesitate to tell anybody about these things. And if they do, it's just like a few people, like their close relatives, their loved ones or something. But a lot of people, especially formerly, would be afraid of being scorned for some of these claims. And so sometimes they're actually deterred from reporting them.
So if someone's lying, they're doing it because they want attention. They're not going to lie for any of the other reasons we're going to probably examine. But lying specifically is an attempt to get an attention. Yeah.
Conscious deception is usually going to be to get attention or money.
Okay.
So then that leads us to the wish fulfillment hypothesis, that this is some kind of psychological defense mechanism against the reality of death. Well, if that were true, and it may explain some things, but if it were true in general, we wouldn't expect to have such consistency between these experiences unless there were some common source of input. So that's going to take us in a moment to the cultural contamination theory. But you wouldn't expect wish fulfillment to generate this common core set of things. Mm-hmm. Also, individuals often report things that conflict with their own personal religious and other expectations of what death is going to be like. So, like I mentioned, people who are not religious coming back and saying, I didn't think there was going to be anything, and here's what happened. Right. You'll also have other people who will have some particular theory of the afterlife, and they come back and say, well, that didn't happen. It was this other thing. And so it's if it was wish fulfillment, you would expect it to fulfill their expectations about an afterlife. Well, what if there is some common source of input, the cultural contamination theory? You would expect then these common core of experiences to not predate Moody's work, because that was the popular book, Life After Life. You would expect the contamination to really spread from there, and it would spread in English and whatever other languages that the book has been translated into in those countries where it's been published. But it's not. You get the same kind of reports from all over the place, including from before Moody's work was published. And the older reports are consistent with the newer ones, although reports of the tunnel have become more common since Life After Life came out. But other aspects, quite consistent. Also, NDEs are reported by people who have not heard about NDEs. So there are people who don't know about, this phenomenon. They've never heard about it. They've never read about it. And then it happens to them.
Right.
And so that's evidence that runs contrary to explaining all of this by cultural contamination. Also, these things get reported by children. And, sometimes early life can be dangerous. And consequently, sometimes children, even very small children, will have cardiac arrest and be brought back, or otherwise clinically die and come back. And they also report NDEs, even though you wouldn't expect them to know about NDEs or the specific phenomena associated with them. One of the things that's interesting is children tend not to report having life reviews or meeting deceased relatives. And both of those could be explained by the fact that children are young. Because if they're young, they probably don't have deceased relatives that they know.
Right.
And if they're young, they haven't lived long enough to have a big life review or to have made major decisions that had impacts on other people.
Right. Of course. That makes sense.
Yeah. Then we come to the dream hypothesis. And dreams are, I mean, as with these others, maybe it explains some of the accounts, but it doesn't seem to explain them generally, because when the heartbeat stops, the brain shuts down within seconds. And dreams take a while, especially lengthy dreams. It's not true. I mean, there's some kind of an urban legend that I've at least heard some people say that, like, you experience a whole dream in like half a second. And that is not true. Dreams track in real time. So if you have a dream that takes 5 minutes to experience in the dream, it took 5 minutes for that to play out in your brain. And so you could not have a multi-minute experience of a dream when, I was in the body, then I was out of the body, then I was watching them talk about me as they're working on me, then I go through this tunnel, then I meet the being of light, and I see stuff I did in my life, and then I'm told I have to come back, and then I come back, and that's a multi-minute experience. And there's no way you could have a dream that is minutes long when your brain has shut down because of lack of blood flow within seconds.
Okay.
Also, dreams are way more chaotic than this common core set of things. People should be coming back and saying, yeah, I was in Sweden, I was on vacation, and there was a giant frog that was attacking the Eiffel Tower that was in Stockholm for some reason.
Right.
So if this were just dreams, you wouldn't expect the kind of consistency that we see across these reports.
Especially given that at the moment of death, people are under intense, unusual stress, and stress will affect the content of dreams.
Yeah, I mean, you might expect some stress-induced content, but you wouldn't expect what we're getting.
Right, there wouldn't be this consistent content of the tunnel and the light and that sort of thing. There would be all kinds of craziness. I mean, when I have stress dreams, there's all kinds of craziness that goes on.
Yeah, it would be, I was naked at work and I'd forgotten the final exam.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So that brings us to the physiologically induced hallucination hypothesis. Could there be something about the dying process that causes people to have experiences like this? So it's not random, like a dream. There's a mechanism or a set of mechanisms that induce these kind of experiences. Well, one thing that has turned up in the data is that NDEs, sometimes they happen to intoxicated people. People get drunk and they have a heart attack, or they get high and they have a heart attack. And when the person is intoxicated, they do report more bizarre and confused experiences that can display kind of hallucinatory characteristics. So there, you have some evidence here of you've introduced a physiological change in the person with this substance, whatever it is, and then they have a distorted, atypical NDE.
Right.
So what produces that? Well, okay, it doesn't rule out that they're having a genuine experience, but since they've introduced a mind-altering chemical into their body, it could, when they come back, assuming NDEs are real, when they come back, that chemical is likely still there, right, or is messing with their ability to assimilate the memories of what happened on a physiological level, because those memories are now going to get encoded into the brain. And if the brain is under the influence of a drug that affects the mind, then it can interfere with memory formation and cause you to have a bizarre set of memories regarding whatever it was that happened to you. So that doesn't seem to indicate strongly one way or the other. There have been proposals that that physiological things produce these experiences, maybe brain damage, the way the brain, certain areas, get damaged, it causes you to have these experiences, or certain neurotransmitters get released as the brain is dying or as the brain is being revived with all that inflammation, or that there are other chemical things that happen, like when the blood flow stops, you experience hypoxia, which is a lack of oxygen to the brain. And people have said, hey, guess what? Hypoxia, like in airplane pilots, their oxygen system goes out, they can hallucinate. And, maybe your brain is releasing endorphins. You're in a painful situation. Maybe your brain is trying to release endorphins to get you out of pain. And that's causing you to hallucinate. Or maybe the drugs that the doctors are pumping into you to help bring you back, like ketamine, which is a tranquilizer, are causing some of these phenomena. And so those have been proposed as explanations.
Right.
The thing is, okay, in lots of cases, there is no detectable brain damage. The person comes back, they're just fine. There's no detectable brain damage. The brain shuts down too quickly for extended NDEs. And there's just no evidence for these claims. They haven't been tested. They haven't been subjected to falsification. All of this is speculation at this point. So you can speculate that there's some mechanism in the dying brain that produces these, but no one has evidence for that. And so you can't simply eliminate and discount these as hallucinations unless you can tell us how the hallucination is happening. Generally, hallucinations are not consistent the way these things are.
What other? So there's a couple other areas that we need to look at too.
Yeah. So one of them is the false memory hypothesis. The idea here is you died and they brought you back and you're in the hospital and you overhear a nurse, let's say, talking about what happened, talking to another nurse about what happened when they were reviving you. And you're kind of, in and out of consciousness. You're not in great shape. You're probably sedated. You're on pain medication, and you overhear this conversation, and then you falsely remember it as what happened. And that could produce cases where people are able to actually report like conversations that happened while their heart was stopped, because they later heard about those conversations and then imagined the experience and falsely remembered it. The problem is this is also speculative. I mean, it can't be ruled out, but it is speculative, and we don't have data of this is what's happening. In fact, in some cases, we have what looks like preternatural knowledge that people really did not have a way to learn from overhearing people in the hospital. This brings us to evidence of preternatural knowledge. Now, one of the stories that is in Parnia's book, Erasing Death, it's one of two books he's got on this subject. There'll be links in the show notes and at the Mysterious World store at sqpn.com/mysterious. One of the stories is told by a man named Dr. Tom Aufderheiter, who is prominent in resuscitation science. And one of the reasons he's prominent in resuscitation science, one of the reasons he took an interest in the field, is because of an experience he had when he had just been on the job as an intern for 5 days. So this is right at the beginning of his medical career. He's still an intern. He's a brand new doctor, and he's in a hospital. And this is several decades ago. And the procedures for how to revive people were not as refined as they are now. And he's told to go into this person who's having a cardiac arrest. He goes in, he meets the person, the guy's eyes roll back up in his head, and he goes into arrest right there. So they shock him to bring him back. And they didn't have much else to do after they've shocked you and brought you back, they didn't have protocols to help keep you stable yet. And so the procedure at the time was you sit with the person, and if he rearrests, you shock him again. Okay. And this can take hours. And so Dr. Aufderheiter is here as a brand new doctor. None of his superiors are here. And he's the only doctor around. He's left to deal with this situation alone. And he thinks to his superiors, why did you put me in this position? Why did you do this to me? Why aren't you here to help me?
Right.
And so he's left here with this gentleman for hours. And the guy periodically rearrests and he periodically shocks him back. Eventually, lunchtime comes and the nurses bring in the lunch for the patient. But the patient is unconscious. So he's not going to eat the lunch, and Dr. Aufderheiter has been here for hours. So he eats the lunch.
Right.
And continues to sit there and just wait and reshock the guy whenever it's needed. And eventually the guy gets stabilized. And he spends, a long time in the hospital recuperating. Before he's discharged, he says to Dr. Aufderheiter, I know you're just an intern, but you're the one who's primarily cared for me. You're my real doctor here. I have something I want to tell you. I had this experience while I was dead. I was floating above my body. I saw you working on me. You thought, why did you do this to me? He said, you thought, why did you do this to me? And then you ate my lunch. And Dr. Aufderheiter said, have you discussed this with anybody here at the hospital? He says, no, I didn't want to, but I wanted to share it with you before I was discharged. And so, we can't rule out the possibility that he somehow heard this and then forgot that he heard it. But based on his report, it sounds like he knew Dr. Aufderheiter's thought, so telepathic information, and then he saw Dr. Aufderheiter eat his lunch. And this is when he's just out. So it's you could propose alternative explanations, like maybe he was clairvoyant and telepathic in his unconscious state, but one way or another, it looks like preternatural knowledge of what happened during this experience, especially the thought, why did you do this to me, that actually happened while he was cardiac arrested before his heart restarted. So this kind of report is quite significant. This is if this is our best avenue for verifying this kind of experience. And so that's what the AWARE or Awareness During Resuscitation study tried to do. And they got an example of somebody where something like this happened. Now they're doing the AWARE 2 study, the successor. This time it's personal, which is even bigger. And they've refined the methodology. They're hoping to have results next year in 2020. One of the things they tried to do in AWARE 1 was they installed shelves in some hospital rooms and put pictures of compelling images on the shelf above the eye level of the people in the room. Okay. The idea was, if you're really floating up by the ceiling looking down, you could see what's on that shelf, but the people in the room can't. And so if you can come back and say, I saw a picture of this on the shelf, that would be compelling evidence. Unfortunately, they only had the one person. The reason what they discovered was the heart attacks, the cardiac arrests, were not occurring mostly in the rooms that had the shelves. Right. And so there was nothing there for most of the survivors to see. Like one of the two people that had a clear NDE was in a room that just didn't have one of those. I think both of them may have not been. But in the AWARE 2 study, they are using iPads for that purpose. They have they have iPads. So iPads are portable. You don't have to bring in a whole shelf and stuff. And they're going to use the iPads to show images and sounds during the period where the brain is not operational. And to make sure it's not operational, they're doing EEGs. They have an EEG cap they're going to slap on the person who's cardiac arresting. Yeah. And they're going to do brain oximetry measurements to measure the amount of oxygen that's getting to the brain to make sure you don't have this brain activity. So they're really trying to use higher level techniques and a broader study with more hospitals involved to try to get better data. And we'll have to see what they come up with.
Wow.
From a reason perspective, the audio evidence is not as good as the video evidence or image evidence, because you could hear things if you've got brain activity. But especially if your eyes are definitely closed while you're doing this.
Right.
If you see things that you could not have seen with your eyes, or if you hear people's thoughts, which you cannot do normally, then, visual or telepathic evidence would be more compelling.
I have to give a personal note on this. I have not had an NDE, but I had an experience of something visual that is hard to explain, but could be explained by false memory or other things like that. But when I was a child, I had an accident on ice skating where I fell on the ice and presumably had some kind of concussion, and certainly had stitches on my face. But while I was in the medical room at the ice rink, I remember sitting on a cot, looking across the room through a door into, I think, the bathroom or something. And I remember they had like these applique flowers on the wall or something. And sitting there, knowing I did not move, and I verified this later, the wall suddenly came at me very close, as if I was no longer in my body. Telescopic vision, something. There's probably a physiological explanation, but it's one of these things that's very strange and hard to explain. And it sort of reminds me of some of this. It's not exactly the same, but I keep thinking about that, like these unexplained things that happen during moments of physiological stress.
Yes,
in the body.
And there are other reports of people leaving their body under grave physiological stress, and we'll be talking about out-of-body experiences in a future episode.
Oh, cool! Can't wait. Yeah. All right, so that's the reason perspective. Now, obviously, there is a faith element to all of this. So,
you think?
Exactly. So, what is the faith perspective on a near-death experience?
Well, the first thing to say is that these experiences, at least at the present state of our information, do not provide proof of an afterlife. They may not be real. They could be due to physiologically induced hallucination, as the brain shuts down or as the brain revives, or they could be due to other causes. Preternatural knowledge, though, is the strongest evidence that these are actual, because if your brain is in the process of breaking, either as it's shutting down or coming back online, that's not going to give you preternatural knowledge. Right. And so the future research onto this, if they can get hard evidence of preternatural knowledge, that will give us hard evidence that something preternatural is happening here. Now, you could still say, I don't think it's an afterlife. I think it's just psychic experiences. But it's something preternatural, and the face value interpretation of, this person died and then they were out of their body and they learned this stuff and they came back. The face value interpretation would be the preferred interpretation. Okay. Because it's Occam's razor. You don't want to overly complicate a hypothesis beyond the evidence, proposing, people have psychic powers as they're dying and then they come back and falsely interpret the psychic powers as an after-death experience. Right. Why don't we just go with it's an after-death experience? Exactly. So we'll have to see if we get evidence. Now, obviously, if we don't, if it turns out there's no preternatural knowledge and there are good explanations for all of these things, that doesn't disprove Christianity either. Or it doesn't disprove an afterlife. There may well be an afterlife. Christianity is still true, but these just don't provide evidence of it if it turns out that they're all to be explained some other way. How does this relate to the biblical picture we have of the afterlife? Well, we're not given a lot of information about exactly how the afterlife works. And a lot of the information we are given occurs in a visionary form where it's mixed with symbolism. So like you read the book of Revelation, we do get visions of people in heaven, but it's mixed up with a lot of symbolism where other truths are the focus of what is being communicated.
Mm-hmm.
The point is not to communicate information about the afterlife. The point is to communicate other information. We're just seeing this from God's perspective in the throne room of heaven. Right. And and we're also not looking at the moments that people are dying and leaving their bodies and coming to be with God. That's, we're seeing stuff after all of that. Okay. So we're not given a lot of information. One verse that could have a bearing here is Hebrews 9:27, where it says, "It is appointed for man once to die and then the judgment." So you could look at that and say, okay, well, if it's appointed for man once to die, then you can't come back. Therefore, these experiences have to be something other than actual afterlife experiences. The problem with that is that's not two problems. One, that's not really the point the verse is making. The point the verse is making is you get one life and then you experience judgment at the end of that life. If anything, it's directed, and that may be all the point that is being made. If there is an additional point, it's probably reincarnation doesn't happen, right? Because reincarnation was a common belief in the Greco-Roman world. So it may be also directed against reincarnation. But the author of Hebrews knew perfectly well that some people come back. Jesus came back. Jesus brought other people back.
Right.
Other people who were not the Son of God. The Old Testament records people coming back. So there are situations where people temporarily die and then are brought back to life for a period before they die again, for reals this time.
Like Lazarus.
Like Lazarus or the widow of Nain's son or various other people.
Yep.
And so Jairus' daughter, another one from the Gospels. So the New Testament does not intend to teach that it's impossible to resuscitate someone when they have died. Resuscitations actually are endorsed by the New Testament. It's just in the Gospels they happen supernaturally rather than because of a cardiac shocker. So that verse really doesn't seem to preclude this phenomenon. Another verse that could have a bearing here is Luke 16:22. In Luke 16:22, Jesus is in the process of telling the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. And in the parable, Lazarus and the rich man both die. And Jesus says, and then they were carried off by the angels. So that's like how they're transported to the afterlife. Well, that seems to correspond to what some people experience. They meet beings that they interpret as angels and that then serve as their guides in the afterlife. Like take them to the great being of love, for example. And so that actually coheres well with this verse. Couple things we have to note, though. Number one, this verse is in a parable.
Right.
So this could just be symbolic detail. However, Jesus's parables are usually based on real life experiences. He'll say there was a king, or there was a son, or there was a farmer who did this. And in the real world, there are, even though he's telling a parable, in the real world, there are kings and sons and fathers and farmers and fields and seeds. And so there may be, as in this parable, angels who serve as your escort, at least for some people.
And I don't want to get too deep into this, but is it true that this is the only parable where the people involved are named?
Yes, this is the only parable where we have a named figure in the parable, Lazarus. And given the subject of, can you send Lazarus back to tell my brothers, is one of the requests of the rich man.
Yeah.
And since there is a Lazarus who comes back, some people have questioned to the extent, how much is this a parable versus a real account?
Right. So that's always a possibility as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
So also one other difference potentially is that this is before the resurrection and thus before Christ opened heaven. And so the afterlife could have worked a little differently in the era that the parable is describing from the way it works now. But in any event, the verse certainly doesn't count against what people are reporting. If anything, it coheres with them.
Okay.
So then we come to, well, what about the non-Christian interpretations of these events where people, let's say you're a Buddhist and you encounter a great being of love and you think, oh, it's a bodhisattva. A bodhisattva being an almost Buddha who deliberately delays enlightenment in order to be able to help other people.
Okay.
Okay, if someone came back and thought they saw a bodhisattva as the great being of light, I would say from a Christian perspective, there are aspects of their experience that they're misinterpreting because reincarnation actually doesn't happen. But maybe, they could have met a respected religious figure who was going to serve as their personal helper at this moment, or they could have misunderstood. They could have met Jesus and thought it was a bodhisattva. One of the things about these experiences is they all are brief. We don't have hours-long experiences yet, but we may, because it is now becoming possible to revive someone up to 6 hours after their death without brain damage.
Wow.
Which we will talk about in a future episode. And you can also read about that in Parnia's book, Erasing Death. He talks about this. These are very brief experiences. And apparently, whatever people learn in the afterlife, at least based on these NDEs, it's not all simultaneously downloaded all at once. You don't get all the mysteries of the universe all at once. And so if you're just having a brief learning experience in the afterlife, there could be things that you just misinterpret based on your expectations. You expect to see a bodhisattva, you see a great being of love, you think that's a bodhisattva, and you get brought back before it's, oh, by the way, that's not a bodhisattva.
We've seen that in the Catholic context where saints have reported apparitions or visions which later were contradicted by church teaching or definitions of doctrines and that sorts of things.
And that brings us to, and so it could be just the person wasn't dead long enough to be corrected about what they were seeing.
Right.
It also could be based on post-resuscitation overlay based on their personal or cultural beliefs. Because if you have a mysterious experience and that's outside of your body without the benefit of your brain, and then you get back into your body, your brain has to make sense out of that experience, and it's likely to interpret it in terms of prior, even if you can't explain it exclusively in terms of prior beliefs and expectations, those may play a role in how you process it. And this is something, as you mentioned, the church recognizes. In fact, if you read the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith's document on apparitions and how to evaluate them, it says that the consciousness of the seer may add some details.
Right.
And so it could be you're back in your body, your brain's trying to process this unbodily experience, and there's some overlay based on your personal or cultural beliefs.
Okay.
Also, there may be errors in your perception of this because you've just been through a very traumatic event. And so, you may have some brain damage or something that is, or at least malfunction that's causing a problem with some of your assimilation of this experience, even though it wouldn't explain all of it, especially if there's preternatural knowledge. So there could be an admixture of other things in some of these cases, like somebody like the one I mentioned. Oh, I heard this. I was going to have a baby, but then I miscarried because the baby got hesitant. And so he's going to be reincarnated or something. That could explain that kind of thing. The fundamental experience could be true. I left my body. I had a life review. I met this being of love. I came back. But some of the more detailed aspects of, oh, I heard this or that may be one of these other things producing it.
And so are there other factors at play in the faith perspective?
Yeah. So one of them is, well, what about hell? I mean, we have heaven on the table here because people report seeing the beautiful city or the great garden or things like that.
Yep.
And they report an experience that is coherent with some modern understandings of purgatory as an encounter with Christ, where you have a review of what you did and you serve as your own judge.
Mm-hmm.
And you have, it's more an organic experience of assimilating everything you did rather than a sentence being handed down from without. It's more of a transformative thing from within.
Okay.
As you're confronted with. This is a view that Pope John Paul II, that Pope Benedict XVI talks about in his encyclical Spe Salvi, where he mentions that some modern theologians, and he doesn't say it here, but he's one of them. You read his earlier books, he endorses his theory that purgatory is a transformative encounter with Christ, where all the consequences of what you've done that are bad end up being burned away, leaving you a more compassionate and pure person. And so some of this could be, purgatorial or purgative for people.
Okay. Yeah.
But what about hell? Well, even if every one of these experiences, and most of the experiences that get reported are positive, even if they all were, even if nobody came back and said anything unpleasant happened to them on the other side, it wouldn't disprove hell, because you know what? Maybe the people who go to hell don't get to come back.
Right.
It's
a one-way door, folks.
Yeah. So maybe they don't. But but in actual fact, that's not the case. Not all of the reported experiences are pleasant. Yeah. As early as Raymond Moody's book, he reported that some people come back and said, I had a very unpleasant experience. And he noted that this happened especially when people had tried to commit suicide. Which, of course, if you do it knowingly and deliberately, is a mortal sin. So people, if you killed yourself, not necessarily in mortal sin, you may have been under a psychological factor that lessened your culpability, but you still had some culpability, and it was made clear to you in the afterlife. Other sources report that although it's less common, some people do come back and report terrifying experiences, such as an experience of just a terrifying void or hellish imagery. So that is part of the reportage. It is part of the data that there are unpleasant experiences that could point towards a purgatory or even a hell. One thing that's kind of tempting here is to say, well, maybe we could do a ratio and figure out how many people get to go to heaven and what percentage of people go to hell. Unfortunately, we really can't draw that kind of inference from the data, because at most, the fact most of the experiences are positive wouldn't necessarily show that most people go to heaven. It might only show that only a few people who would otherwise go to hell get to come back.
Right. Yeah, just similar to what you had said earlier.
Yeah. Ultimately, we shouldn't be looking to these experiences. While they may confirm or provide supporting evidence for the Christian faith, they are not what the Christian faith is based on. Right. The Christian faith is based on other evidence, arguments for the existence of God, proofs of the resurrection of Christ, various other things. It's not dependent on these. So whether these turn out to be true or false, natural or supernatural, one way or another, at most they're a kind of nice to have, but they're not a proof or disproof.
So, Jimmy, what's your bottom line when you look at the near-death experiences? What's your conclusion?
Well, in making a theological assessment of these, one of the things that occurs to me, even if they're purely explained by, and this isn't really my bottom line yet, but one of the things that occurs to me, even if they're just a natural process that causes these, for most people they are pleasant. And they do open people up to thinking about love and what they've done in their lives and what's in the afterlife and being judged and all of these things. even if it's all natural, maybe it's something God has built into our nature as a kind of last-minute evangelization. We often talk about how God gives every person the possibility of salvation, even if it's in a mysterious way that we can't see or perceive. Maybe this is how he does it for some people. Maybe some people, even if they've never lived for God, they've never thought about it, there could be something even built into our bodies that as they're dying, we start to have experiences that free us from pain, open us up to thinking about love and our lives and accountability in the afterlife, that could open us to accepting God's grace in that moment. So even if it's natural, maybe it's a form of natural last-minute evangelization. Maybe it's a moment of mercy to ease the transition into the afterlife. Also, the conception that is reported, and I kind of mentioned this earlier a little bit, but the conception that's reported here of self-judgment, of being confronted with what you've done and acknowledging it and owning it, rather than like an arbitrary judgment imposed from outside, that coheres very well with a lot of modern Catholic understandings of what judgment in the afterlife is going to be like. So there are elements of this that do cohere well with modern Catholic theology. In terms of a bottom line, I think NDEs, now some apologists love them and will, and not just Catholic, but non-Catholic as well. Some apologists love them. Some apologists hate them. So I've encountered both, people being very favorable or very skeptical towards them. To me, they are intriguing, but they are not yet conclusive. If evidence of preternatural knowledge holds up, then that will provide good evidence of afterlife, and that will shake up things in the world. If we get really solid evidence of people coming back with preternatural knowledge, that will shake up society. It would not, though, no matter what people come back with, it wouldn't undermine with these brief experiences anything about Christianity, because we aren't seeing, even if this is the afterlife, we're not seeing far enough into it.
Right.
These people are there for a few minutes and come back, according to these experiences. It's not like they get to stay in heaven and have a tour of a big tour of the mysteries of the universe. So we're not seeing enough to contradict or confirm the fundamental teachings of Christianity. So it doesn't really bear on that one way or another. And finally, as I indicated, these are not the evidence Christianity is based on. It's based on other evidence that we do have in this world right now. And that's what serves as the anchor of our faith. Not these things, although it would be nice if they can provide a little extra chiming in.
Okay. I just had a thought, something occurred to me, a question occurred to me that we didn't cover earlier. I'm sorry to bring it at the very end, but does the length of time people report experiencing in this afterlife vary depending on how long they were flatline? I mean, to clinically dead? Does it vary?
My understanding at present, and this is that this is just suggestive, but the data is suggestive that actually the longer they stay dead, the less likely they're going to remember anything because of the brain trauma.
You did mention that, yeah.
Yeah, so we didn't apply it in this way. So people may be having longer experiences and just not remembering them, because when they come back and all that blood flow starts after the brain has been silent for a while, wham, you get more information and inflammation, and you can't assess the information as well into your memory.
Okay. So I'm sure people are going to want to dig into this subject some more. So what are the further resources that you have for folks to check out?
So I have a link to a talk by Dr. Sam Parnia on YouTube. He gave it last year in 2018, and it's part of a conference, but he gives a brief talk where he deals with some of this. I have a link to, and these books will also be in the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World store at sqpn.com/mysterious. So you can link to them there. They're all on Amazon. One of them is Raymond Moody's original book, Life After Life, that started the big trend. Another is Sam Parnia's book, Erasing Death. Another is a shorter book he wrote a few years earlier called What Happens When We Die, also again by Sam Parnia. Then there's a book called Varieties of Anomalous Experiences. And this book is it's a book dealing with psychology. In fact, I wanted to say it's published by the American Psychiatric Association, but I may be misremembering that. It's authored by a pair of individuals named Etzel Cardena and Stephen J. Lynn, and it looks, as the title suggests, at anomalous experiences and the people who report them and the psychological effects of them. And one of the chapters is on near-death experiences. Okay. There are also chapters on other things like alien abductions and stuff like that. But this is like a serious scientific work looking at what do the studies say about these different anomalous experiences that people report.
And you're right. It is the American Psychological Association.
Okay. Also, I have a link to an article where Kevin Malarkey retracts The Boy Who Came Back from Heaven. So you can read what he had to say about that. And I have links to results from the AWARE study. It's not full results because you have to get behind a medical journal paywall for those. But partial results, a summary of them, is provided, as well as a kind of fuller look at the results along with a critique by other near-death experience researchers, because you have not everyone thinks Parnia's methodology is the best. Some people think by looking just at the cardiac arrest patients, he's being too narrow.
Okay,
and so others will think you can get a clearer picture if you look at data more broadly. So you might want to check that out as well.
Well, so that's the main topic. So I want to get to our mysterious feedback. We've got some great feedback again this week from our the Lost Planet Vulcan episode. Fred wrote on Facebook. He said this was a great overview of the challenges faced by astronomers from the early telescopes to Einstein and beyond.
Yeah, one of the images that really kind of, I think, is a testament to them is how in the hunt to find Vulcan, these guys were risking their retinas looking through the sun, at these telescopes in this primitive stage. They were really putting their eyesight on the line for science.
So, and then on our episode where we talked about the mystery of astrology, Tom Carroll writes on Twitter, "Okay, Jimmy, I have to ask, if stars are in some sense alive, do they have souls?"
Right. Now, so in that episode, I mentioned that life is very tricky to define. And by some definitions, some people would say fire could be considered alive, even though we don't normally consider it alive, because it has metabolism, it consumes energy, it replicates, it does a variety of things that life does. Well, stars do too. Stars consume energy, they have metabolism, they have a lifespan, they reproduce, and they even evolve from one generation of stars to another. So another proposed criterion for life is it needs to be subject to evolution. It needs to develop and change over generations, and stars do that. Later stars have more metals in them than earlier stars. So by a really broad definition of life, you could say maybe stars are alive. Well, I'm not saying they are. I'm just saying it's interesting to think about. But if it were true that they were alive, then they would have some kind of soul, because the soul is the life principle. It's the substantial form of the body that keeps it alive. That's why the Epistle of James in chapter 2 says, the point he's making is, as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead. Well, the body without the spirit is dead. So you need a soul in order to be alive. All life forms, according to Catholic thought, have some kind of soul. It may not be the kind of soul that survives death, but human souls do. But we don't know about plant and animal souls. The common thought is they don't. But if stars did turn out to be alive from God's perspective, then they would have souls from God's perspective.
Okay. So, and then on our Bigfoot episode, going way back to the second or third episode we did, Robert Pacheco wrote in a comment on sqpn.com, says, "I'm a skeptic, but not all footprint casts are easily dismissed as fakes. It's intellectually dishonest to suggest otherwise, Mr. Akin. Where's the costume? Why has it never been produced? Why trust self-described con men?"
Okay, so I think Roberto may have assumed I was taking a more skeptical attitude than I actually do. I don't claim all footprints are fakes. I think some footprints are just mistaken interpretations of other things. I also think, I can't rule out the possibility that some footprints really are Bigfoot footprints. So I'm not saying that all footprints are fake. I'm not saying that all Bigfoot encounters are fake. In terms of the Gimlin-Patterson film, which is what we were talking about with the costume, what we can say with certainty is someone connected with this story is conning. Whether it's Gimlin and Patterson who took the video, or whether it's the people later who said, I made the costume and I was in the costume, is an open question. So that could have been a real Bigfoot encounter, but we do have people willing to fess up to it. And, as we talked about in our Jimmy Hoffa episode, you can't always take every confession as accurate, but, so I can't rule this out as a genuine Bigfoot video, but there is reason to think it's not. That's all my claim is.
Yeah. Somebody's lying.
Yeah.
So, and then just a bit of general feedback. John B. sent us an email. He said, I've recently joined Patreon in order to support Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. I listen to a lot of podcasts, but this is definitely my favorite and the only podcast I donate to because I wouldn't want to lose it. I love this podcast because Jimmy does such a great job researching, giving arguments for both sides, and I just trust him because of his Catholic worldview. And he says, please consider doing an episode on reincarnation stories. They seem to be everywhere, and some of them are tough to argue unless they're all made up.
And we will be doing that. Want to let you know, John B., we touched a little bit on reincarnation here, but we will be dealing definitely with individual reincarnation stories and the topic more broadly in future episodes. I know, for example, we're going to be talking about The Search for Bridie Murphy, which was a book in the 1950s, based on a case in the 1950s of a woman who reported memories of a past life in Ireland. And this was what popularized reincarnation in American culture. And then there was an investigation. And the investigation did not go well for this. So we're going to be looking at that and other claimed stories.
Excellent. And again, John, thank you so much for your support. You're right. It is necessary to get that support from listeners. As you can tell, there's a lot of work that goes into producing this show and all the shows we do at SQPN. And it just certainly would not be possible to create this show and any of the shows without financial support from you folks. So we greatly appreciate it.
Yes.
That's so much appreciated. So, Jimmy, do you have some mysterious headlines for us this week?
I have two. Since we were talking about the hunt for the planet Vulcan, I thought I would mention a couple of stories related to that. One of them is a news story suggesting there may be no Planet 9 after all. So for people who may not be aware, Pluto haters, and I'm sorry, Pluto is a planet.
Yep.
And one day the International Astronomical Union will re-recognize that fact, as many of its members want it to do, because fundamentally anything that is big enough that gravity rounds it, but small enough that gravity doesn't make it glow due to nuclear fusion, is a planet. So Pluto is a planet. So are lots of other bodies in our solar system. But the head Pluto hater then proposed, who was the moving force behind getting Pluto declassified as a major planet and reclassified as a dwarf planet. He then proposed, but there is another bigger one out there, which he then called Planet 9, even though there's way more than 9 planets.
Right.
Should be called Planet X because it's unknown, and because X is a cooler name than 9. And so he claimed that just like when Uranus was found because of the orbits at Uranus and Neptune, they were affecting orbits and we could deduce where they should be. Same thing. Now he thinks there's another planet out there and we can detect it and its proximate position based on the orbits of things in the outer solar system.
Okay.
Well, you may remember from the Planet Vulcan episode, that was the argument that there's a planet closer to the sun. Mercury has this weird orbit. Maybe that was explained by a planet even closer to the sun. Or maybe it was explained not by a planet, but by a group of asteroids, smaller bodies that collectively had enough gravity to bend Mercury's orbit. in other words, what are called Vulcanoid asteroids that are still hypothetical. They're still looking for them. Now, it turns out the real reason for Mercury's orbit being weird is because of relativity and the sun's gravity. But now we have some people looking at the Planet 9 theory saying, it doesn't have to be one big planet. Could be a bunch of those dwarf planets. Ha 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 ha. So the idea is maybe there's a big elliptical disk of outer Oort cloud objects, including comets and asteroids and dwarf planets and things like that. And all of that is what's generating the Planet 9 effect, because they haven't found it. So you can check that out. And to my mind, that would be great. I mean, I'd love to have a new planet one way or the other. If we get a new big planet out there, it'll force reconsiderations of these issues, and that's good, and it's always cool to have a new planet. But if we don't have a new big planet out there, it's nice revenge for the guy who tried to kill Pluto. Other big story, another space story, deals not with our solar system, but with the center of our galaxy. At the center of our galaxy, there is a giant black hole, like at the center of most galaxies. Ours is called Sagittarius A star. It's called Sagittarius because that's the constellation that the center of the galaxy is in. And so the big black hole at the center of our galaxy, Sagittarius A star, is one that we've actually been able to image in significant ways. We can see things going around it, and we can see things falling into it. And it's really fascinating to look at the orbital tracks around the black hole at the center of our galaxy. It's amazing. But you can look at some of that up on YouTube. But recently they detected some emissions that radio jets from Sagittarius A star that look like the black hole may be pointed directly at us. Ooh. So fortunately, it is over 20,000 light years away, so it's not a danger. But black holes do have poles that point in different directions, and the radio jets they've seen from it may indicate it's pointed at us. So be careful. The Eye of Sauron is watching.
Excellent. So those are our two headlines. Before we end the episode, folks, as I like to do, I want to again take a moment to thank our patrons who make the show possible. Like I said. And today, of course, we want to make sure we thank by name some of them every week. And this week, we're thanking Leela K, Matthew G, Bob M, Paul B, and Les H, and John B, who sent us this feedback through their generous donations at sqpn.com/give. They make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at sqpn.com. And you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. So that's it from us. Send us your feedback on this episode. I'd love to hear what you have to say about the mystery of near-death experiences. And Jimmy?
Yeah, I also wanted to mention on one of the new things we're doing for our patrons on Patreon is we're giving you a chance to vote on upcoming episode topics. So one of the benefits you'll get in exchange for your support is the ability to help us pick upcoming topics. So thank you very much to all our supporters. That's one of the things we wanted to do for you.
Excellent. So, and like I said, let us know about what you think about this topic. But especially if you've had a near-death experience, we want to hear from you. We want to hear what you've experienced. That would be a great addition to this topic. So how do you do that? Visit sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page and leave some feedback on the episode in one of those two places. You can send an email to mysterious@sqpn.com, or you can send a tweet to @MYS_world with the hashtag of mysterious feedback. And remember to like this episode on the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, retweet it on Twitter where you find it there, share the podcast with your friends, write a review in iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. That all helps us grow the community of listeners and to reach more people. That's why we do it. You can find the links to our discussion and our further resources and links to the mysterious headlines on our show notes at sqpn.com/mysterious. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
And thank you.
And once again, I'm Don Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.